All right, so let's finish up with utilitarianism. So we've seen the main ideas. Let's look at chapter 2, and we'll sort of go through the chapters a little bit. But so what Mill is doing here, in addition to laying out the basic claims of utilitarianism, is then also defending utilitarianism from some of the criticisms that have been made against it. And the first thing that Mill really wants to deal with is the idea that that utilitarianism is a kind of hedonism or Epicureanism. Epicurus was a ancient philosopher who taught similarly that the good was pleasure and nothing more. And so when Mill is defending Bentham and Epicurus through Bentham, what he's trying to do is show that for all of these thinkers, Bentham and Epicurus, and for himself as well, the fact that pleasure is the foundation of the good doesn't mean that utilitarianism, or for that matter, Epicureanism, has no interest in virtue, in noble acts, and is something more than just a license to pursue bodily pleasure with no limit. So the first thing to note, and Mill doesn't mention this here, but it's a very important part of Mill's philosophy and utilitarianism in general. The first thing that prevents someone from pursuing pleasure to any end whatsoever is what Mill calls the harm principle. And this is a useful sort of supplement to the principle of utility because it circumscribes what kind of pleasure one is justified in pursuing. The harm principle states that I'm able to do anything I like up to the point of harming someone else. So I can pursue pleasure, but if that pleasure is found in harming someone else, then I don't have the right to pursue it. I can't, utilitarianism begins with self-interest. Why should I be good? Because being good is about attaining happiness, attaining pleasure. There's nothing wrong with self-interest at all in utilitarianism. Self-interest is the engine of utilitarianism. However, right, if we understand utilitarianism to be sort of carte blanche on pursuing self-interest, one might be worried that it is going to make people feel like they have the right to do literally whatever they want, hurt other people, etc. Right? So you have to impose some kind of limit on self-interest. And so the first limit that Mill will insist on is the harm principle, right? If your self-interest will result in other people being harmed, you don't have the right to pursue it. So that's the first important part here, and that fits in with the larger utilitarian structure or idea, right? Because if my pleasure involves someone else's pain or requires someone else's pain, then the principle of utility is not satisfied, right? I'm not doing what creates the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. I'm just doing what creates the greatest amount of pleasure for myself. So I have to always be taking into consideration other people. My freedom ends where your freedom begins. That's another way of saying that. But there's something more, right, that Mill wants to do with this idea of pleasure and utilitarianism that's involved in this defense of Jeremy Bentham and Epicurus. So the first sort of criticism that Mill responds to is the idea that utilitarianism will lead to a society of pigs, right? So on the bottom of page 5, right? The view that life has, as they express it, no higher end, no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit than pleasure, they describe as utterly mean and groveling, a doctrine worthy only of pigs. Right? So this leads Mill to this discussion of higher and lower pleasures. And so higher and lower pleasures, I think this is where Mill starts to become really Aristotelian in the way he thinks about pleasure. The idea that certain pleasures are worth pursuing more than other pleasures. Right? Some pleasures are better to be avoided, not because they're about, as Aristotle had it, fulfilling your essence or realizing your proper goal. Right? It's not about the purpose of a human. Mill doesn't think there's a purpose to being a human in that way. Rather, higher pleasures are better than lower pleasures because of the quality of the pleasure, because they are more pleasurable. And this is a kind of interesting claim, right? So Mill will say here that noble and, as he calls them, active pleasures are better than the passive pleasures that are, deemed ignoble or unethical. So here he is parsing out pleasures in a way that's not dissimilar to Aristotle at all, but it's in this different context, right? And so he'll say, well, let's read, right? So page 5 again. When attacked in this way, the Epicureans have always answered that it is not they, but their accusers who represent human nature in a degrading light, because the accusation implies that human beings are capable only of pleasures that pigs are also capable of. And so we have this sort of tendency to think of pleasure as an animalistic desire, right? Animals want pleasure. Humans want nobility. They want excellence. They want virtue. Right? And so those pursuing pleasure are animalistic in some way. In general, what Mill is doing here is separating pleasures of the mind from pleasures of the body. And he will call pleasures of the mind active pleasures and pleasures of the body passive. And the activity, the activeness of pleasures of the mind is what makes them ultimately higher than lower pleasures of the body, right? So we can also see a connection to Aristotle there, right? That real pleasure, high quality pleasure, comes from action, comes from being active rather than being passive. So pleasures of the body are, for all the reasons Aristotle gives, also for Mill, less good, right? They are transient, they're out of our control. We rely on other things in order to get them. And so if we think that true pleasure is bodily pleasure, then we're going to be unhappy as often as we're happy, right? As happy as we are to, have, a chocolate cake, if that's the only source of our pleasure, we're going to be unhappy whenever there isn't chocolate cake. So that speaks also to the passiveness of these pleasures, right? Bodily pleasures are passive because they happen to us. They aren't something that we do ourselves, and therefore they aren't things that we are in control of. Bodily pleasure happens to us, it's passive, it requires external objects, and for all these reasons is less good. Active pleasures, similarly to Aristotle again, are going to be pleasures involved in cultivating the mind and in improving the world. Bringing pleasure to other people will also be a possible pleasure if we learn to make it a pleasure. So, but let me say a little bit about why this is more of a problem for Mill than it is for Aristotle. This question of what kind of pleasure we want to pursue. Because for Mill, the principle of utility states, right, the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. There is in this principle of utility the inherent sense of quantity, right? What I'm looking for is a lot of pleasure. Now, if I'm looking for a lot of pleasure, it would seem that the easiest way to get a lot of pleasure would be to get a lot of low quality pleasure, right? Which is to say that I could just eat Twinkies in bed, watching TV, drinking beer, smoking weed, whatever it is that makes you have that kind of pleasure. I could have all of that all the time. Now, maybe we've talked about this in class, but why not pursue that kind of life? If happiness consists in the greatest amount of pleasure possible and the least amount of pain possible, then why should I ever risk pain by leaving my bed? Why should I ever stop eating the Twinkies, each one of which gives me a small amount of pleasure? And if I have enough of them, that adds up to a lot of pleasure. Why do anything if I can get simple pleasures all day long in my bed? What is it that recommends higher pleasure? Right? So Mill has several answers to this, but we can also recall Aristotle's answer, right? Which is not just that it requires some external thing, but that those kinds of pleasures are ultimately going to make me incapable of exercising all of my faculties, right? And being able to exercise my faculties is a greater pleasure than the pleasure that I get from eating Twinkies, right? So if I just sit in bed eating Twinkies all day, I will eventually, my body will atrophy. I will be unable to get out of bed, and I will, go into cardiac arrest. So, even that stupid example works in the sense that if I continue pursuing that pleasure endlessly, that pleasure will become something other than pleasure. It will become pain. And so, uh, but what's more important is, well, where that pain comes from, ultimately, is the pain of letting my life atrophy, letting my body atrophy, failing to use all my energies, to do all the things that I can do. So, although Mill doesn't say that there's a purpose to life in the way that Aristotle does, right? The purpose is to, uh, enter into rational political debate and action. There's no purpose to life, but it's still the case that the human being, because of our constitution, the human desires certain kinds of pleasure, certain particular types of pleasure. It desires the kinds of pleasure that are unique to it. So he says, again on page 5, the comparison of the Epicurean life to that of beasts is felt as degrading precisely because a beast's pleasures do not satisfy a human's conceptions of happiness. Human beings have higher faculties than the animal appetites, and once they become conscious of them, they don't regard anything as happiness that doesn't include their gratification. Right? So once we are aware of the kind of happiness that we can get through, for example, education, we're no longer satisfied with mere physical pleasure. Happiness, we realize, must consist of other kinds of pleasure, namely active pleasures. So Mill will say, how do we know? Well, first let me say, to return to this question of quantification, right? That the person who has experienced the pleasure, say, of learning another language, of seeing a beautiful sunset, of being in a healthy romantic relationship, knows that that kind of pleasure is greater, is more than than bodily pleasures, the bodily pleasures of food, of sex, of comfort, that sort of thing. They understand even that some amount of pain is worth suffering in order to achieve those higher pleasures. So the higher pleasures, the active intellectual pleasures, are so much greater than the physical pleasures that they can even counterbalance the pain that it sometimes takes to achieve them, right? So learning a language is painstaking, it's difficult. Being in a healthy relationship is difficult and involves pain also. But those pains are worth bearing because the pleasure that is the end result of them is so much greater than any pleasure you could get without having gone through those pains. And so that there's some pain included in the greater pleasure, but the greater pleasure is still worth achieving because it's so much more than the passive bodily pleasures. Now, that experience of higher pleasure is also than what prevents us from living like animals. We're able to have that higher pleasure based on the kind of being that we are. Right? We have the capacity to learn languages, learn instruments, uh, mathematics, sciences, whatever. We have a rational faculty, right? And we can't help but engage with that. Once that's engaged, we inevitably learn that one kind of life, one kind of pleasure is higher than another, and we are bound to pursue it. And so it's impossible, Mill thinks, for us to desire the life of an animal. Utilitarianism is certainly not advocating that we live like animals. So that's an interesting question to ask yourself. Would you like to live like a pig? Would the life of a pig be happier, better, more pleasurable than the life of a human? Or the life of a dog, right? Would the life of a house dog, a domesticated dog, be happier than the life of a human? We might be tempted to think yes, right? And if we think that the life of a dog seems better, the only way that could possibly be true, according to Mill's schema here, is because a dog doesn't have a rational faculty. We might wish that we didn't have a rational faculty, we didn't have a brain, but we do, right? Unfortunately, for better or for worse. And because we have a brain, we are bound to learn that these higher pleasures are better. So on page 7, Socrates gets into this a little bit more and asks, well, this leads to another question. Right? The question is, given that we have this rational faculty, does that mean that the greatest amount of happiness comes through the greatest amount of knowledge or education? In essence, it is a different variation on the question of, are animals happier than humans? The question Mill asks next is it better to be ignorant or educated? Are the uneducated happier than the educated? Is ignorance indeed bliss? So, right, we might think, for example, let's imagine we are in a relationship and our partner is cheating on us. Right? Do we want to know? Would you rather know that your partner is cheating or remain ignorant of that? If you're ignorant of that, you're able to believe everything is good, right? Everything's going well. You're happy. You're taking pleasure in your relationship and in your partner. And the only thing that knowledge of that infidelity will do is ruin that pleasure, ruin that happiness. So why would I want to know? Why would I ever think that knowing would be better? That somehow that would make me happier? I want to know, and I'll be happier to know, because when I have the truth, when I really know what's going on, I'm able to, right, direct myself away from danger. Right? Uh, Only by knowing the truth and being educated am I able to actually act in my self-interest. So again, it's motivated by self-interest. I don't want knowledge for its own sake. I want knowledge because knowledge helps me pursue my self-interest. I'm able to make myself happier when I have all the information. So on page 7, Mill gives uh, another distinction. He says, anyone who thinks that this preference for knowledge takes place at a sacrifice of happiness, anyone who denies that the superior being is, other things being anywhere near equal, happier than the inferior one, the pig or the human, the ignorant person or the educated one, is confusing two very different ideas, those of happiness and of contentment. So, happiness versus contentment. Contentment is a kind of resigned indifference, right? Things are fine. I'm content, right? I don't need anything to change. The pig is content in the pigsty, right? The dog is content. But happiness is something different, right? Happiness is about being active and about, right, fulfilling your desires. And as a human being, those desires are going to be rational, engaged by the rational faculty. So it is true, of course, that the being whose capacities of enjoyment are low has the greatest chance of having them fully satisfied, and thus of being contented. And a highly endowed being will always feel that any happiness that he can look for, given how the world is imperfect. But he can learn to bear its imperfections if they are at all bearable. And they won't make him envy the person who isn't conscious of the imperfections only because he has no sense of the good that those imperfections are imperfections of. Right? For example, the person who isn't bothered by the poor quality of the conducting because he doesn't enjoy music anyway. Right? So the displeasure that the educated person feels, or the superior being, the human compared to the pig feels, is going to be significantly less important than the pleasure that that superior being or educated person is able to feel, right? Would you rather be able to appreciate music but have to sit through a bad band every now and then? Or would you rather avoid any bad bands by not being able to enjoy music at all, right? The answer is pretty clear there. So he goes on, it is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig think otherwise, that is because they know only their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. Right? So again, if it were true that ignorance is bliss, then the educated would stop educating themselves as soon as they got any education. Right? They would realize that it's better to be ignorant or uneducated. But because they don't do that, we can assume that they who know both conditions, being educated and uneducated, are better able to judge, right? And judge that education creates more pleasure and more happiness. So how is it that education produces this kind of happiness. Right? Why does it give us pleasure? So let's take an example. Think about education. Let's think about learning to play the piano. Right? So maybe you took piano lessons as a kid, right? Or maybe you didn't. I didn't. If you took piano lessons, it's likely that you hated the piano lessons, or you didn't like them. They weren't pleasurable, right? On a Saturday afternoon, instead of playing with your friends, you had to go, sit in a room and practice scales and sheet music reading. Not fun, right? More fun as a kid to be out with your friends doing nothing. So when you're a kid, you imagine that pleasure is right in playing, in not learning. Not learning is a pain. However, once you have gone through piano lessons, once you've learned the piano, although the process of learning was painful, having learned the piano provides you with a whole new outlet for pleasure. Having gone through piano lessons, the world is now more open to you and provides you with more opportunities for pleasure. Moreover, you've learned a way of expressing yourself, a way of acting and creating for yourself. What's important here is that the world opens up to the educated person. To the educated person, as Mill says, everything is a source of interest and a source of pleasure. The world is alive to the educated person who takes an interest in learning about things. To the uneducated person, the world is closed. So we can see this in the piano example. Right? So the person who's learned piano, the piano is a means of artistic creation, a means of artistic expression, of self-expression, a means, moreover, of beauty, a means of pleasure and enjoyment. To the person who doesn't know how to play the piano is a dead, closed object. Right? They can't do anything with it. They can't make it produce anything. They don't have an opportunity through the piano. So for the educated, the world is open and full of opportunities for pleasure. The uneducated, opportunities for pleasure are much fewer. And so this returns back to the idea of active pleasure. And we could think here of another famous philosophical distinction between positive and negative freedom. There are two kinds of freedom. Freedom from something and freedom for something. Freedom to do something. When I don't go to piano lessons, when I don't get an education, I'm free from the pain of sitting in that room learning my piano scales. I'm free from having to go to school and write papers. Right? I'm free from any of that. Nothing concerns me. Free to do whatever I like. right? However, if I submit myself to the pain of piano lessons or any kind of education, and by learning that disciplining myself, going through that pain, forcing myself to not do exactly what I want every moment that I want to do it, then I get freedom to do something. In our example, I'm free for piano playing. I'm free to play the piano. I'm free to express myself on the piano, free to create beauty on the piano. So by sacrificing freedom by sacrificing the ability to do what I want the moment that I want to do it, I open myself up to having much greater freedom to do much more, right? What I'm capable of doing is much greater. Right? The person that never went to piano lessons has a more limited range of opportunities, limited range of capacities and powers. And so while they have never not done what they wanted to do, the things that they're capable of doing are much more limited. The person that sacrifices negative freedom and goes through the pain of not doing what they want to do at every moment gains at the end of that the ability to do much more that they want to do. Right? You're able to serve yourself much more in a more pleasurable way by denying yourself certain things at certain points, suffering a certain amount of pain, and then, right, the payoff is this positive freedom, the freedom to act, freedom to do. And so this kind of pleasure that we get through education is active. It allows us to act. It makes us more active and capable of action. So, we're beginning to run out of time, but let me mention a few things, right? First of all, I want to touch on an important development in utilitarianism that is not touched on explicitly in this book, but which is important and takes us back to the trolley problem. In the 20th century, a distinction is made between what's called act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. And the difference is that one judges either the act or the rule, obviously. But we think about this in the context of, right, so on the one hand, we'd say we want to do those acts which will produce the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. The other says we want to produce the rules that produce the greatest amount of pleasure or happiness for the greatest number of people. So if we think about the trolley problem again, we'd say, well, the act in that case that will produce the greatest amount of happiness is to kill the one individual and save the five, right? So we evaluate the situation at the level of an act. However, we might also say, if we are rule utilitarians, that there is a rule which states never kill anyone. if we follow this rule in every case, it will produce the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. And that perhaps in this one case, by killing this person, more lives would be saved. But overall, if we say never kill, that is going to have a greater net outcome of pleasure and happiness. So we might push back against this trolley problem scenario and say, no, you shouldn't kill the person because there is a utilitarian rule which states never kill. And although in certain instances, maybe breaking that rule would, in that case, produce a utilitarian outcome, we have to think about things more broadly. And so we would say we're rule utilitarians, never kill. We think about this in general. Now, the problem with that is that, how do we calculate that? How do we know how far back and forward we need to calculate? How can I ever sort of calculate the consequences of a rule? It's much easier to calculate the consequences of an act. Although, sidebar, right, one of the problems with utilitarianism and any kind of consequentialism is, well, how do we really evaluate the consequences, right? How do I delimit the consequences? How do I say these discrete consequences are the consequences of that action? How do I know that, right, as a result of my action, one of the 5 people whose lives is saved goes on to be a mass murderer, right? Am I responsible for that? Leads to a whole set of problems about responsibility and causality and cause and effect and all of that. But, that's a topic for a different discussion. Close sidebar. The reason I bring up rule utilitarianism is because rule utilitarianism is developed in response to another thing that I mentioned earlier, which is Mill's interest in ethics for a mass society. And this is also connected to this question of education and creating conditions in which everyone is able to get the greatest amount of pleasure. So, if the principle of utility states that one should do that which produces the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, and we've seen that the greatest amount of happiness comes through these active intellectual pleasures that are attained through education and the cultivation of yourself through virtue, then the goal of utilitarianism has to be to educate all people to the greatest extent possible. That's what will lead to the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. So Mill is concerned with what he calls social arrangements. And he thinks that through utilitarianism, through utilitarian rules and laws, a utilitarian society, it is possible to achieve a society of educated people who take pleasure only in those higher pleasures, or the great majority of whom do. So Mill is interested in society, social arrangements, in social justice in a certain sense. And he thinks the reason why people don't pursue higher pleasures, the reason why they accept contentment rather than happiness, is not because of anything about them as individuals, but is instead a result of society. We as a society are not giving people the opportunity to pursue these pleasures. So he thinks, right, young people in particular need to be shown and given the opportunity to experience these higher pleasures. And when they're given that opportunity, they will pursue them, right? They'll pursue them in the way that we just discussed. They will prefer them over the lower pleasures. The reason why we have a society of people that only are interested in bodily pleasure, aren't interested in these higher pleasures, is not because people are bad or lazy or stupid or anything like that. It's simply because they weren't educated, they weren't exposed to higher pleasures at the right time in their youth, right? So for Mill is, I think, the first philosopher to argue that the reason that people are in the first place interested in lower pleasures is a failing not of an individual, but of society, right? That society is failing individuals. And so we could think of Mill as, in some ways, one of the first thinkers who understands society as a system and people's failings to be a product of that system. The reason why people are unethical is because of systemic failures. And he thinks if we were organized according to utilitarian principles, we wouldn't have these social problems. And so I think that's the idea that I'm going to close on here. We'll certainly come back to this idea. There's certainly a lot more in the essay and more that we could talk about. Maybe I'll mention this, right, as a lead into our discussion of Kant. Mill is a pragmatist. And in some ways, he is an advocate of the idea that the ends justify the means. What we're going to see in Kant is the exact opposite. Kant thinks that in ethics, we can never take into consideration any practical concern, any pragmatic concern. For Kant, the answer to the trolley problem is as obvious as the answer is for Mill, but the answer is the opposite. One should never pull the lever. Right? One should never intentionally kill someone. So we'll talk about Kant in plenty of depth, more depth than we'll look at Mill. But there is one point of connection between Mill and Kant, something that Mill takes from Kant. And that is the idea of what the ultimate motivation for following the principle of utility will be. So, the principle of utility begins with self-interest. We should always follow the principle of utility because it's in our self-interest to do so. But the part of the principle of utility that we might not follow is the part about helping other people, right? That we should always do that which will not just give us pleasure, but give the greatest number of people pleasure. And that's really where the ethical content of utilitarianism comes from, right? That I have to do that which helps the greatest number of people possible. Why should I do that? Mill thinks there is an inherent sense of duty that human beings feel, an objective duty. And that it's this sense of duty that compels us and motivates us to follow the principle of utility. And that duty can be found a little bit in what we were just talking about, right? Because of the being that I am, I have some natural inherent duties, right? Because I crave active intellectual pleasure because of the kind of being I am, I have something like a duty to pursue it. But I also have this inherent sense of duty to other people that Mill thinks is kind of transcendental or objective, at least. And that duty to other people stems from the fact that I am inherently, necessarily, and inevitably bound up with other people, and that other people are essential to my own happiness, my own pleasure. So we have this kind of built-in sense of duty, and this is the last chapter of utilitarianism. And that duty is what is going to ultimately drive me to this. And this is something that Aristotle does not have, sense of duty, right? Ultimately, for Aristotle, my first and final motivation is my essential purpose as a human being. And to some extent, that's true for Mill also, in that my sense of duty is found in my inherent political being, the fact that I am a political entity in a social order, right? I live with other people. There's no way around that. And my natural way of dealing with that is to have a kind of sense of obligation to other people, a duty to care for other people. But Mill is different from Aristotle in articulating this as a duty, right? I have this sort of inner sense of right and wrong. Now, he wants this to be something different than the kind of moral feeling I have, the moral sentiment that might prevent me from pushing someone over a bridge to save other people's lives or something like that, right? He thinks it's not a moral sentiment because it's not unique to any particular culture. He thinks all people feel this duty, and that therefore there's something as essential as self-interest in that duty. And so that is also going to be picked up by Kant. And Kant will say that my reason for being moral is this innate, even transcendental sense of duty. All right, so we'll leave it there and see you next week.